All right. Well, I'd say thank you for having me here today. Like Brian said, I'm from The Ohio State University. So today I'll be presenting my job market paper entitled, "Do All Types of Community Forest Management Projects Actually Protect Forests?" This is using data from Guatemala's Biosphere Reserve. And also just to say, I'm happy to answer, clarification questions throughout. If you have a question, go ahead and, raise your hand or shout out. So before I jump into the details, I'll just talk a little bit about kind of a quick overview of the research so you know where I'm going with everything and some of the key findings that we have. So as the title implies, I'm interested in looking at the before and after effects of the community forest concession policy in Guatemala. So this policy grants property rights to these community groups that have to apply to become a concession or an association, and then once they apply, they're able to have property rights to an area of forest where they can harvest timber and whatnot, as long as they uphold a sustainable management plan. So I'm interested in looking at is this policy effective, and then two, there are 12 different of these community forest concession groups in Guatemala, and so while they all formed under this same framework and they have to follow the same regulations, the communities themselves are actually very different. So I'm also interested in looking at how these socioeconomic effects and the backgrounds of these different communities affect their effectiveness in implementing this concession policy. So the general results indicate that we do find that they are effective, but the results vary a little bit depending on the type of community that is implementing the policy. So this is a picture of the Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala. So to give you a little motivation first, worldwide, the past 10 years, we've had over 10 million hectares of forest lost every year to deforestation, some natural causes. So given this, alarming number of forest loss, there's been a lot of strategies implemented to protect forests and reduce this forest loss. The most widespread one is creating, as they call it, protected area status, so creating national parks. But community forest management has also become an increasingly popular strategy for multiple reasons. It has a lot of benefits outside of strict protection. With community forest management, you're giving income and livelihood potential for these local communities that have often lived in the area for multiple generations. They might be dependent on the forest for its resources. So you're kind of meeting these dual goals of environmental conservation and poverty reduction. And additionally, this also reduces the resources needed by the government to implement forest protection. So they don't have to build fences or hire guards. If the community is given the proper incentives, then they'll protect the forest and manage it sustainably on their own. So, there are hundreds of these projects in operation around the world. The actual effectiveness of them in terms of how they reduce deforestation is somewhat inconclusive, which I'll talk more about in a minute when I talk about the literature. Another kind of motivation is to have a more rigorous study of this to see are these methods effective. And then, and given this kind of uncertainty regarding community forest management, considering that it's likely going to be an important part of ongoing climate talks, specifically when you think about the future role of REDD, it's a UN program, it stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. So these REDD projects are aimed at developing countries with tropical forests and trying to figure out how to give these communities benefits while also promoting sustainability and conservation. So, community forest management kind of fits this bill ideally, but also given that there's all this uncertainty, it's better to have, as we move forward with these negotiations, it's important to have a better idea about the role and the effectiveness of community forest management. So that's kind of the motivation behind some of this research, moving just a little overview of some of the current literature and where it stands right now. As I mentioned before, there is no real consensus, so I listed a couple studies here, Gontom and Webb, Bray et al., that have found community forest management to be generally effective, but we have a couple other studies here who have found it to be inconclusive or less effective than, say, strict protection or some other type of form of forest protection. So that's kind of where the literature stands. Bowler et al., they did a report on community forest management, specifically looking at a different range of studies. They look at 42 studies, and this is kind of a quote from the report that says, "Many studies rely on crude empirical designs that don't correct for selection effects or other sources of bias." So one of the main problems they found with these studies is that they don't correct for selection bias, which means that the non-random selection of community forest areas. So instead of just randomly selecting areas, saying this is community, this is not, usually there's some sort of non-random selection process going on, which could bias the results. If there's some factors that affect selection into a community forest area that also impacts deforestation, so you're going to get a biased treatment effect. And then another issue that they found is that a lot of these studies don't assess the before and after effects of the policy. They might just only do a post-policy or within one area with no control group. So just a little bit more on the literature. So the majority of research thus far is looking at these, they call like forest-dwelling communities or kind of indigenous populations that have lived in around these forests for a long time. But in reality, or around the world in all these tropical forests, there's very different types of communities that live there. So actually trying to understand how the characteristics of the community affect their ability to reduce deforestation is important to kind of extend the literature. And also, these studies, a couple studies have also found that these socioeconomic characteristics do in fact have an effect on forest conservation outcomes. So Doliska et al. Found that income, education, and women involvement improves forest conservation behavior. Alex Garcia found that group size, so like smaller group size and higher secondary education, had a better effect on reducing deforestation in community forest areas or common property forest areas in Mexico. So given that these factors have been found to be important in assessing conservation behavior, it's important to take them into consideration, which I do in this paper by separating the 12 communities based on some of these characteristics and looking at them as separate groups. So that's the literature. So given all of that, I'm going to kind of just outline some of my objectives for this paper. The big one being assessing the overall effectiveness of this community concession policy while accounting for the differences among these community concession groups, where some have been living in the forest for multiple generations, they're dependent on the forest resources. Others are recent migrant communities that have moved to the area in search of land for farming, and then we have a couple other mixed backgrounds with different levels of wealth and education. Secondly, second objective is to fill in the gap in the literature. As I mentioned before, we do have this kind of inconclusive mixed results with the current literature. So here I'm hoping to address some of the methodological issues with selection bias and before and after effects, and to have a more rigorous estimation of the effectiveness of these things. And to do this, I use a matched difference-to-difference approach, which I'll explain as I go into the methods. And then finally, a goal is to estimate leakage associated with the concession policy. So leakage, or often referred to as spillover, is if the concession policy being in place, and so the increased management of a concession area displaces deforestation or shifts it out to areas outside of these concessions. So if that's the case and we don't take it in consideration, then we might think that the policy did reduce deforestation, when in reality it might have just shifted it. So we're not getting any net decrease in aggregate deforestation. So as far as I know, this is the first paper that's focused specifically on community forest management that estimates leakage. And we do find evidence that leakage is an issue in some community types, but not in other types. So, on to the actual research. So this is a map of the reserve, and if you look up here, we have, I guess I can use this pointer. This is Guatemala. It's in the northern department. It's called the Petén, is this department of Guatemala. And then it's bordered by Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula on the north, and then Belize on the east. So this is the reserve. The different colors kind of represent the different zones, which I'll describe more in just a minute. The reserve was formed in 1990 under kind of increasing pressure on the land and the resources. They created the reserve. It also is home to a lot of cultural and historical sites. This is such as Tikal National Park. This is a pyramid in Tikal, which is inside the reserve. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also a big tourist area. So trying to, recognizing that the land was under increasing pressure and that we're trying to protect these historical resources, they created the reserve, and then they divided it up into 3 different zones. So the core zones are the protected areas. They're under strict conservation. These include the national parks, the Mayan heritage sites, and the ruins. And then we have a buffer zone, which runs along the southern border of the reserve. It's kind of to reduce impact on the core zone. And then these multiple use zones, which kind of make out the core of the reserve. And this is the home to the community forest concessions. So, as I'll show you in a...
Define concessions.
So they're community groups that form an association and then apply to get concession rights to... I'll talk more about them in just a minute, actually, right now. So, yes. So, like I said, there are these 12 different forest concessions, and in order to gain concession status, they had to form a legal association, they had to create a sustainable management plan, they had to conduct an environmental impact assessment, all of this with the help of a non-governmental organization. This project was funded by USAID with a lot of money. So once they are approved as a concession, they're granted property rights for a renewable period of 25 years, and then they're allowed to harvest timber and non-timber forest projects. So that's where the kind of the livelihood sustainability comes into play, where they're sustainably managing this area. They can harvest cedar and mahogany are the most common high-valued timber in the area that they can harvest, and a couple other local species. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have these 12 groups, and they all formed under the same legal framework. They all have to follow the same rules and regulations, but the actual communities are quite different, and they have a lot of different characteristics which need to be taken into consideration in this sort of analysis. So I'll describe the 3 different types of communities, and this is how I break them up, but this is also how other people who have studied this area, the Baten, have also kind of divided up these concession communities. So the first is what I call the long-inhabited concessions. There's 2 of them, and they're kind of these forest-dwelling populations. So they've been in the reserve since the early 1900s. They, collect timber, non-timber forest products. They harvest wood. And of the 3 groups, they have kind of the median income and the education. So this is actually a picture of one of these concessions, and you can see this is actually the concession area, and then this is the village within it. So these groups live inside the concession, inside the reserve.
What is a non-forest timber product?
A non-forest timber product is essentially any products in the forest that aren't timber related. So in this case specifically, chicle used to be really common. It's an ingredient for chewing gum, so they tap a tree and get the sap out of it. And then there's also shate is another popular one, which you might have actually seen. A lot of them are in church and Easter flower arrangements. They're these green leaves, and they stay green for I think 6 to 8 weeks. So they cut them in the forest and then they ship them out to different places. So those are sort of pine nuts. Those are all kind of examples of non-timber forest products. And even and then so that's the first group. The second group I call them the recently inhabited concessions. So these groups are they don't have a lot of forest experience. They moved to the area more recently, mostly looking for land to farm on. They have kind of this agricultural background. And they also have the lowest income and education of these 3 groups. And then the last group is the non-resident concessions. Oh, so I also should mention, these recently inhabited concessions also are inside the reserve. They live in communities in the reserve. Whereas this non-resident group don't live in the reserve. They live in kind of bigger towns along major roads at the bottom of outside the reserve. So they travel into the forest concession to harvest timber. And these have more mixed backgrounds. They have higher education, higher income. They typically also have jobs outside of forestry and farming. So a lot of them might be school teachers, they might be government workers.
What kind of agriculture?
Mostly subsistence farming. So they're very, like they said, these recently inhabited ones are very poor, so they might just clear land, grow maize and grow beans for mostly their own consumption. So these are the 3 different types of communities. As I've described them, and as I'll explain more in a minute, they are quite different. And so to address this in the analysis, I actually separate the forest areas into 3 groups based on which concession they are in. So while there's one concession policy, it's almost like looking at 3 kind of sub-policies based on what group is implementing this policy and managing the forest. So here's the map again. So as we see, these green areas are the protected areas, and this is a buffer zone. So with these non-resident concessions, the people that live outside of the reserve are here. There's one here. And the main people live along this road down here. And they travel up into the concession. The 2 resident ones, these yellow ones, are the forest-dwelling communities that have been there since the early 1900s. The community has. And then we have these group of non-resident concessions, of resident non-indigenous concessions that are here, which are the recent migrants who have primarily farming backgrounds. So these areas, these beige areas in between, are also part of the multiple use zone, but they're not under any specific management plan or strategy, and so these are actually make up the control areas from which I compare the deforestation in these concession areas to these deforestation rates in the reserve, but not in the concessions. Those areas make up the control group. Just to give you some kind of statistical evidence that these concessions are indeed different. If we look at, so this data comes from a household survey that I took last year. I was in Guatemala for about 2 months interviewing the members of these different concessions. So if we look at these non-resident ones, as you can see, they have the highest education, they have the highest income by far, more than double of the others. And they also have the highest percentage of them, over 50%, don't have jobs in farming or forestry. If you look at these long-inhabited concessions, the ones in the 2 top communities, they have the middle income. They have the highest percentage of them are the ones that own or that have experience in the forest sector, and the highest percentage, 76% of them, are born in the PTEN, which is the department where the reserve is based. So, like I said, these people have been in the reserve for the longest period of time. And then we have these recently inhabited migrant concession groups. They have the lowest education, 2.5 years on average, the lowest income. Over 86% of the members surveyed reported farming as their primary occupation. So they have the least forest experience. So these are kind of just outlines of what the member kind of profiles look like for these concessions.
How do people join a concession? Do they sort themselves into these different ones?
So I think there's been some that also varies, where some of these non-resident concessions, they were more eager to form concessions, so they kind of formed their own groups and, sought it out, whereas some of these recently inhabited concessions, they're mostly come from farming backgrounds, so they weren't really as interested in joining, but it was more, they were promoting it in the reserve, and some of them were even, you could say, like, reluctant to join, but they did because they were afraid if they didn't, they might have to move out of the reserve and, like, off the land. So there's kind of some various reasons for why they formed. And then these two were, they have been long established communities, so it kind of made sense for them to form concessions, and they were probably slightly pressured, but more willing to do it than some of these people with all only farming backgrounds.
Are there any major issues of land ownership, or is it pretty clean in terms of buying and selling?
Technically in the reserve is government-owned property, so they're given the property rights over this land, but they can be revoked if they don't follow their management plan. And in these concessions, the members are given an allotted amount of land in the concessions for their own personal use, so often for farming. But at the same thing, if the whole concession fails or is revoked of their status, then they would be moved out.
So the own land variable means what then?
So some of these people own land outside of the reserve, and then these, if they own, maybe is generous, and it's like if they control land or manage land, it falls under this. So we ask them, do you own land that you harvest or plant crops on? So this map is to give you an idea of where the deforestation that is actually taking place. So as you can see, the buffer zone and then this park has a lot of the deforestation, but in the actual kind of core area, most of this deforestation is happening in these recently inhabited concessions. So there's a road here that goes up here, and it kind of is spreading out from the road. There's also a road here, but it's going through Tikal, which is heavily guarded. You can't just drive up that road. So that's kind of why this road, I guess, doesn't have as much impact of deforestation similar to this. And then we see these non-resident concessions, and the upper ones don't have as much deforestation in them. So this area has been under the most pressure, which is understandable given the increased population and the background of the people that live in those communities. So to give you a little description of the data, I use land use data from satellite imagery from the reserve. The unit of observation is a 30 by 30 meter parcel of land. And so for each parcel of land, I have data on, the distance to the nearest road, the distance to the nearest village, its elevation, its slope, the distance to the nearest, archaeological site and whatnot. So these are some of the control variables that I have in the included in the analysis. The main variable of interest is the outcome variable, which is determining, the deforestation rates. So it's binary. If the parcel of land is forested or deforested, it's 1. If it's forested, it's 0 otherwise. And so as I said, we're looking at 2 periods of analysis. this pre-period before the concessions were established from 1990 to 1997, and a post-period from 2000 to 2009. So we can compare deforestation rates before the concessions were active, and then after the groups were actively managing the area. So the method I apply is a matched difference in difference approach. So I'll start with first kind of explaining the matching process and how that works. Matching methods are used typically when you don't have, randomized experimental data. And so the goal is here is that you have some sort of policy or program that you want to test how effective it is. So you have a treatment group that undergoes the policy or participates in the program, and then you have a control group that doesn't undergo any change, and then you're trying to see some comparison of some outcomes. So maybe like a test score or income, or in this case, deforestation between these two areas. So for my case, the treatment groups, as I said, are the concession areas, the 3 different types of concessions in those, all the forest areas in those concessions, and the control group are those kind of surrounding non-concession areas in the reserve that I pointed out on the map. So the idea with matching is that it controls for selection bias. So for example, if these methods have been used recently in studies that have been looking at the effect of protected area status on avoided deforestation. So it's pretty well documented in the literature that these protected areas tend to be more remote and have higher slopes and elevations than non-protected areas. So if you don't consider these factors, if an area is more remote, then it's farther away for people to get to, they have to travel, so it's probably going to have less deforestation than an area that's closer to human settlements. Or if the area has really steep slopes, it's harder to clear the land, it's less suitable for agriculture, so that's another, it's also likely to be less deforested because of those reasons. So if these protected areas are also more remote and have higher slopes or steeper slopes than these other areas that they're comparing them to, if you don't account for these factors and you just say, oh, the deforestation is way lower in these protected areas, then you're overestimating the effectiveness of the policy, when in reality these areas probably weren't going to have much deforestation regardless of whether they were protected or not. So if you don't account for that, then you end up with a bias estimate, which is what we refer to as selection bias. So the same idea kind of applies to these concessions, where the concessions weren't randomly selected into forest areas. So we try to control for for any differences between the concession forest areas and the non-concession areas. And to do that, we match the observations in the concession areas with the non-concession areas based on the same idea. The distance to the road, the distance to the nearest village, the elevation, and the slope for these things. So what we end up is with 2 control groups, a treatment and control group, that are very similar to each other. And then when we compare deforestation rates, we can attribute that difference more to the policy than to some other environmental or location characteristic. So the main assumption that we have when we're doing this matching is what they call the selection on observables. So in order for matching to work and for it to reduce selection bias, when you match the observations and the treatment control, you have to account for all of the factors that would affect selection into this concession group or into the treatment group. So that's what they call selection on observables. So as I said, I address this by matching on all of the environmental and location characteristics, but then I also, after I match the data, use a difference in difference model that will also further control for some of these unobservable factors that I'll talk more about in just a minute. So there's a lot of different types of ways to match your data. I'm not going to go into all of them. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but I'll describe a little bit about the method I use primarily, called propensity score matching. So the idea is that you have a treatment and control group, and you want to try to estimate the probability that an observation will be selected into the treatment group, or in this case, selected as a concession into a concession area. So you get a number, or you run a logit, you get a probability for that this parcel of land is going to be selected for a concession based on where it's located, how far it is from a town, what the elevation is, all those factors. So you end up with a propensity score, or a probability for every observation, and then you match observations in the treatment group with the control group, and so you end up with a similar group. And then any observations in the control group that are not similar to any areas in the concession, you would drop those from the analysis, so you only have groups that are similar to each other. And the goal of this matching is to achieve what we call the best balanced, meaning that the control group and the treatment group are statistically similar across all the different observable variables that you measure them, that you have to describe them. So we measure balance by, one way to measure balance, there's different ways, is by looking at the difference in means between the treatment and control group. So we might look at, the difference in elevation between the treatment and control group and see if it's a big difference, then we assume they're very different. If it's a smaller difference, then they're similar, and we want that difference to shrink as we match the groups. So this is just kind of a practical example of this is looking at the recently inhabited concessions. So here the raw treated, raw control, these are the unmatched groups, and these are for their propensity scores, one being 1% probability of being in the concession. As you can see, these groups are very different looking at their propensity scores, but after we match them, they're a lot more similar. So this is the unmatched data, and then this is the matched data. And then, we have this huge group of control observations that are very dissimilar, and so those are almost all dropped, and then we end up with these two groups that are more similar to each other. I know this is a big table, but I just wanted to highlight how the matching works with actual data. So if we look here, this is the distance to the nearest village. In the unmatched data, the mean difference between these two is about 6 kilometers. So we could say that on average, forest observations in the non-resident concessions are, say, 16 kilometers away from a village, and observations in the control areas are 10 kilometers away. So there's a 6-kilometer difference. And then after matching, we find that this difference goes down to less than 1 kilometer. So we've made the two groups look more similar. The same thing happens for elevation. Before, the non-resident parcels on average were 30 meters higher in elevation than the control group. And then after we match them, it goes down to a 12-meter distance difference. So as we can say, ideally we'd want all of these to be 0, meaning that they look identical, but considering that we're matching across a bunch of different characteristics, we're trying to do the best we can to make the two groups as similar as we can.
Are you doing a separate match for each?
So yeah, so as I said, I draw from the same control group, but I use a different treatment group based on the different concession communities. So that's the matching process. So once I've matched the data and I have my matched sample, then I use that and I apply difference and difference analysis with it. And so for difference and differences, usually you would compare maybe a treatment and control group and compare deforestation rates. But with difference and difference, you're actually comparing before the policy was in place with the deforestation rate after the policy was in place. So it's a more robust estimate. One of the benefits of difference and difference is that it controls for unobservable factors not accounted for in your data. So for example, in this area, there is actually a lot of drug trafficking that goes on, and there's they call them drug lords, or and they have certain areas in the reserve that might be considered hotspots, and you could guess that maybe there's less deforestation going on around these areas since people are afraid to go there because they're owned and controlled by these drug lords. So I don't have data on where these hotspots are. So to me, it's an unobservable factor I can't account for. But if, say, these hotspots are closer to the concessions, then so that means that these concessions have less deforestation than these areas that are not close to these hotspots. Then I'm attributing, when I compare deforestation rates, I'm contributing this reduced deforestation in the concessions to the policy, when in fact it's because they're closer to these hotspots, which is unobservable in my data. So with difference and difference, you can kind of control for that. So say, for example, the concessions have 2% less deforestation because they're close to these, hotspot areas. So if I don't difference and difference, I just compare across treatment and control, I would be overestimating the effectiveness of these policies by 2%. But if I use a difference and difference and I compare within the concession, pre and post, then that 2% drops out, cancels out, and then I'm just looking at the change in deforestation pre and post within the concession and comparing that change pre and post in the control group, so I get a more robust estimate of the policy effect. So this is kind of a general difference in difference regression equation. This y is your outcome variable. So like I said, 1 if the area is deforested, 0 otherwise. We're mostly interested in this kind of interaction between the treatment and the post. So treatment being in the concession area, the parcels in the concession area, post being in the period after the policy was implemented. And this beta 3 variable is our difference in difference estimator, which can be interpreted as the difference in deforestation in the concession that would have, the avoided deforestation in the concession that would have happened without the policy. So if there had not been a policy in place, then there would have been this much more deforestation in that area.
Do you have any sense if your unobservables are mostly time invariant, or do they change over time?
So that's a good question or point. In order for difference in difference, like I said, my example to work, that would mean that the drug lords would have to have the same effect over time on deforestation rates. So in that example, which I think could actually be realistic, there has been a presence of drug trafficking, up through the 90s, and early on. It's kind of one of the motivations for having the reserve and protecting the area. But I can't say whether the locations have changed, which would affect. So I don't know about that exactly. And then lastly, in order for difference in difference to work, you have to have this parallel trends assumption satisfied, meaning that you assume that your treatment and control group have the same trend in deforestation. Even if the policy never happened, you'd assume that they'd have the same trend. So this doesn't mean they have to have the same deforestation rate, they just have to have the same trend line. So if we look at this graph, the treatment and control groups are the same color. And so this pre-concession period, 1990 to 97, the data is not perfect, but you can arguably see there's kind of a similar trend in the data. And then this is kind of the interim period where the concessions were being formed. And then here we see that, any sort of trend that happened here, the deforestation rates kind of diverge, which is what we would expect to see if the policy was having some sort of effect. And then this graph is done with the matched data, so we're actually looking at the matched treatment and control data. All right, so on to the results. So as I mentioned before, the concession policy was considered effective in reducing deforestation across all the different groups. So it ranged from about 3% less deforestation in some areas up to almost 8%. A little surprisingly, these recently inhabited concessions are the ones that had the largest treatment effect on reduced deforestation at almost 8%. So given the area of the concession, we can estimate how much actual avoided deforestation took place. And so for these recently inhabited concessions, avoided deforestation amounted to a little over 5,000 hectares. So for these areas, like I said, it is a little bit surprising, given that if you were to look at that map I saw, or the map I showed you, those red areas were primarily in these concessions. But so you might think that the concessions not have any effect, which is what would happen if we were just looking at this unmatched data. But in reality, even though there was a lot of deforestation in that area, the concessions still reduced more beyond what would have happened without ever having the policy there. So in that case, we can say that they were effective. However, it is important to note, which I'll talk about in a second, is that these concessions are also the only ones that did experience leakage, where some of the deforestation shifted from inside the concession to areas outside the concession. So these are kind of some of the results. So as I was talking about recently inhabited concessions down here, this is the matched result, where it's that almost 8% reduction. But if we look at these this unmatched result, and we don't consider the differences in the selection bias, we would think that the concessions actually increased deforestation in these areas, which would be incorrect assessment. So that's why it is important to match and selection. There was evidence of selection bias. In these other two areas of concessions, we see in the long-inhabited, those forest dwelling concessions, they reduced deforestation by about 5%, and the non-resident by about 3%. Here we see that the matched and the unmatched have a more similar rate, which we would just assume that that's because these areas are more similar pre-matching than these two areas. So finally, kind of as a sensitivity robustness check, as I mentioned before, I also estimate leakage. So it's important because if you don't estimate it and then you're just shifting deforestation out, you're still overestimating the effect of your policy. So in order to do this, we estimate leakage, and how I do this is by creating buffer areas. So around each concession boundary, I have different buffer areas, about 2 kilometers let's see, 2, 5, and 10 kilometer buffer areas. And then I compare areas within the buffer. So now any observation within this 2K buffer is like the new treatment group, and I compare it with areas farther away from the concession boundaries to see if there's more deforestation taking place inside that buffer zone. And then if I do see higher deforestation rates in the buffer zone, then I can say, okay, that might be due to leakage from the concession policy pushing out deforestation. So and this is a similar method used in a couple other studies that assess protected areas and leakage. So leakage was only found in the concessions with migrant populations, and primarily in the closest 2K buffer zone. They had about 15% more deforestation in that 2 kilometer buffer zone than in the areas farther away from the concession boundaries. So that does sound like a lot, 15%, but if you actually determine about how much deforestation that was and you subtract it from the total avoided deforestation, you get a net of about 3,200 hectares. So you're still getting a positive net avoided deforestation, even though there is some leakage in these areas. In the other two concession areas, the non-resident and the long-inhabited, there's no evidence of leakage. So this table is only showing you the recently inhabited concessions, and the others, there's none of these results were significant. So that is indicating that leakage wasn't an issue. So here we see in this matched group, again in the same thing, I matched areas within the buffer zones to areas farther away to control for selection bias, so we're looking at similar areas. And so we see that, so in the 2K buffer zone, deforestation was 15% higher. And then we see kind of the signs change as we move farther out away from the concession boundaries, so I don't really have anything to say about what happens as you get farther and farther away or how much the leakage extends to, but in this 2K buffer zone we see evidence that there is leakage at least up to a 2 kilometer radius outside of the concessions.
It's still in the multi-use zone?
Mm-hmm. Alright, so kind of to wrap things up now and go over some of the policy implications I have from the results. First is that, we do find using kind of more robust estimation methods that these concession policies as a form of community forest management are effective in reducing deforestation. Whereas the previous literature had kind of this was ambiguous about how effective they were. So secondly, the concessions were successful across a wide range of community types. So as I mentioned before, primarily they've looked at these indigenous populations, but here I'm able to look at, recent migrants, kind of these long-term forest-dwelling populations, and some of these more mixed urban populations and how they are effective in reducing deforestation. And we find that they were successful across all ranges. So, this has implications for implementing these types of policies in other regions of the world with, similar communities and near similar tropical forest areas. And indicating that yes, they can be successful in reducing deforestation using these concession model. However, as we said, leakage was an issue, but only in certain types of concessions. So if you are trying to set up some sort of policy, maybe you have to take more care with that policy addressing leakage if you're focusing on these agricultural migrant communities compared to some other forest-dwelling communities. Leakage may be a concern. So that's my presentation for now. So I'm ready to take any questions that you have or comments that you have. Thank you for your time. Mitch.
Do you have any information on the density of forest within your parcels? That is, do people go from maybe clear cutting these parcels to just making them less dense?
So my forest variable is kind of all or nothing. So it's based, I assume, on 70 to 80% of this parcel being forested. It's forested. If not, it's deforested or degraded. So I don't have ideas about the range of how forested it is, just whether it's yes or no, kind of.
Well, not on that segment, but do you have information on the types of trees in different areas? Maybe one area has a higher concentration of a specific species, and I can see that being an issue since you're using satellite imagery data. Not all species of trees have the same foliage density. So if you're using some sort of, I don't know, like a color measure, I don't know.
No, that's a good point. I don't have the data that tells me like, oh, this is the type of tree in this area. I just have kind of, I could say, oh, this area has this percentage of trees, but I can't pinpoint where that is located beyond like the concession area, because they have reports on, this concession area is this percentage of mahogany and this percentage of cedar, but it's not connected to the actual map. So that is kind of, I guess, a weakness, is that the measure of deforestation is a little weak in this area.
It's kind of an open question, but how would you use this framework with different property rights? For instance, what if the land was to be privately held and you have to implement a policy or evaluate the policy somehow? I'm asking this question because I really don't know how to look at this mechanism in a way that is a robust estimation like this one.
So, so this is, community forest management is kind of a broad umbrella of types, and then this is specifically to, these community forest concessions. But in general, I think a lot of the land, so you need to have government-owned land that has the control and, has the ability to grant property rights and, legally enforce that, for one. But I think from, based on some of the FAO data, that a large portion of the tropical forests in developing countries are government-owned. So, so there's that. And then also there are these concession setups. I know in Indonesia and also in Bolivia, there's kind of similar, and I don't think they're not like this, but they're also, I think they would have the potential because they're already kind of a concession-based system, and so I think maybe those areas would be the prime ones for trying to I'd like to do further research, maybe looking at those areas and specifically to see how these effects translate into other types of other regions. But yes, this is kind of specific to certain forest areas and not to, privately owned or other types. I don't know if that answers your question.
Following up on that, the Gates Foundation and others really emphasize scalability. So is this a scalable solution to RED and other things? Is kind of builds on that point.
So I think there is potential for it. Right now, like I said, there's a bunch of different types of community forest management, and so I'm just looking at one in specifically. So I think as further research maybe tries to test others, we can have more evidence of which ones look like they have the most promise moving forward, and if we want to scale up, which one is going to be the best option to follow. So so far I feel like these results indicate this has a lot of potential for it, but it might come down to issues of like how many different regions is this a feasible strategy to have in like I said, beyond Indonesia or beyond Bolivia, are there other places in the world? And also, I think it would take more research looking at what are some of the other property rights structures in some of these countries of interest that have tropical forests and these kind of local communities. But in general, one big issue is how do we reconcile these rights, the roles and the rights of these indigenous populations that want access to these forest areas and their resources, with protecting the forests, and so I think this is has shown to work and be a feasible option in this case, at least. Sorry, Mitch, and then.
So you show that within areas that have concessions, that demographics are important. Are the demographics for the areas that don't participate in these concessions that you matched on, are they similar to the demographics of the participating groups?
So I can't match on like the specifics like income and education because I just match on the distance to village, the distance to a city, and the road. So in that case I can't get that in depth of detail. But in the other, I think in this case specifically in the reserve, it's not as big of an issue because in those remote concessions on the right, no one was living up in that area, so you didn't have to worry about those like demographics. And then in the two. Those communities were pretty similar. Not all of the members in those communities may actually be concession members, but they all have a similar background. And then the same thing in the migrant communities. The majority of those people living up there were not concession members, but they all had migrant backgrounds, which is why the deforestation was the highest, and maybe why we saw leakage is those non-members switched from going into the concession and they moved outside to clear their plot of land for farming. So I think it works in this case, but it'd be harder to address if I had like another forest data set.
Can you talk a bit more about leakage? So leakage is the idea that you're now restricting supply, and so there's pent-up demand that's not being met where it used to be. And so that demand has to be satisfied somehow. Either it gets shut off because prices are too high, or it finds another area where that will supply it at that level. So why is it that we think that demand must come from 2 or 5 or 10 kilometers from that specific concession? Why is leakage supposed to be so narrowly defined, and why is that a strong test of leakage?
So that's a good question. So for this, you can look at leakage on different scales, right? So you can have a local leakage measure, which is what this is, or you have a broader international scale. You might expect to see actual changes in local and market prices in Guatemala if there's more demand for trees and less supply. But in this case, since the majority of deforestation in this area is going on by these subsistence farmers that are clearing land for their own personal use, I think that this is a somewhat appropriate measure to use. I wasn't sure what the actual scale of the leakage is in terms of how far it would extend, which is why I tried to use different different distances of the buffer zone, and it seemed to be the 2K or 2 kilometer buffer zone was where the most of the leakage took place. One thing that this doesn't address is that this area, beyond just the local subsistence farmers, there's also issues with cattle ranchers, which are not poor subsistence farmers. They're going to clear land and then put all their cattle there. So if these concessions deterred these cattle ranchers from settling here and they moved to like another part of the reserve or south into the buffer zone and then deforest the area there, that would be another form of leakage that I'm not accounting for. So this is a more narrow form of leakage. But I think mostly I'm just trying to show that it is an issue even on this local scale where I'm not even capturing all of it, but we do have evidence that there is some existence there.
I mean, they could go to the next country over, right? That demand as well, and that's not going to be captured. And is that any better or worse for a global solution than this, I guess, is the issue.
So, I don't really know. I think that leakage is a big issue for, in general. So, I mean, if you think about all these talks about, with the RED program, the RED Plus program, one of their biggest concerns with this is how do we ensure that there is no leakage? How do we ensure additionality? So I think that's an important question that people are still trying to figure out how to address this, and how to measure it, how to figure out whether it's happening or not. And so I can't claim that this paper is doing that, but I think it's definitely an area for future research.
Can you talk a little bit more about enforcement and monitoring stuff?
So the main source of enforcement is that these these community groups that form the concessions actually form these, they call them vigilance committees, where they're paid and they go out and they kind of monitor the boundaries of the concession. So that's the main source of enforcement in terms of preventing people. And if they find a fire or if they find an area of land cleared, then they report it, and it goes they document that. So and so you could just, and part of the other reason for identifying the different community types is you would assume some communities might be more effective in this vigilance or might be more vigilant about it, and so in that case more effective at reducing deforestation and keeping out people.
So there's no, I guess I'm wondering who's checking up on the areas in the zone that aren't in concessions?
Those are not really being checked up on. I mean, they're in the reserve, so it's illegal to deforest there because they're protected, but there's no people going there to monitor, I mean, outside of random checks maybe by the governing organization, but they're arguably, understaffed and underpaid in general for this huge region, so it's unlikely that they're doing very good checks on all the areas of the reserve. So I mean, you saw even in some of those parks where all that deforestation took place, kind of almost like a paper park they call it, where they call it a park, but there's no enforcement or protection going on there, and so as you can see, there was a lot of deforestation that took place there.
And so you don't think that would have changed once the concessions were started, that they would have differentially and externally have different levels of enforcement or monitoring that would affect the difference that you're observing?
Oh, so you mean, since they assume that concessions are being monitored now, they can monitor the other areas more.
Right.
That's true. Or less.
That would be more problematic.
Yeah, more. If they monitored more, then that would make my results underestimated, whereas if they monitored less, it'd be kind of overestimating. So that's something, a good thing to think about. I guess I haven't really looked into that. I just kind of generally assume that there isn't, and like outside of like DeKalb National Park and a couple others that are heavily monitored, there's no general monitoring taking place. I mean, they have checkpoints in roads, but I don't think there's people going into the forest and checking that. There's satellite monitoring where they can look at fires and whatnot. But I don't think there's much on the ground.
So suppose the satellite imagery data is getting a lot better now. Suppose, how would your analysis change? This might be a question you get from an environmental sciences person once we get capability for LiDAR and other improved techniques for monitoring foliage and things like that.
I think it would help make better, I mean, if I had, actually the data set I'm using, they're currently trying to improve upon and make it meet the standards of the red requirements. So ideally I would like to kind of get my hands on that data set once they finish working on it and then maybe rerun some of this analysis. And they have, they actually define the different grades of deforestation, like you said, Mitch, so instead of just saying yes or no, they say it's degraded, they say it's, for 40% or 80% covered, and they also include what happened before. So maybe it went from being kind of grassland to forested, and then it was deforested, and then it was forested again. So I think that would actually allow me to kind of see, so maybe in some of these areas, there's concession areas that were previously deforested, go as concessions, and then the concession actually helped them become reforested. Or the same thing, maybe in some of these areas outside that were deforested early on in, say, 2000, by 2009, they were back into forest.
So which of your econometric challenges would that address?
So right now, I do difference and difference with 2 cross-sectionals. So I'm not using, I don't have a panel data set, but if I have improved data, I would actually have a panel where I could track each observation over time and say it was deforested here in this year, 92, and then it was reforested in 95.
So you don't observe your 30 by 30 meter parcels more than once?
No, I only have, it's like hazard data. I only have the year that the deforestation occurred. I don't have what happened after that. So like if it's deforested in 97, then that's all I know. I don't.
That's not clear. It wasn't clear.
I tried to not get into that because I thought it would be confusing.
So you construct the before and after in terms of, was it deforested in the pre-period versus was it deforested in the post-period?
So I have like a separate post-concession observation where I take out everything that's been deforested previously, so I'm only looking at forested observations. And then I compare the deforestation rate with those in the post-period.
So did you consider using like a hazard model? What's the probability that a plot is deforested after the
time to
concession?
deforestation?
Yeah.
Every time I present this, someone says that, and so I brought it up once, and I think Brent, my advisor, and I talked about it, and he kind of steered me away from that, and so I haven't pursued that. But I mean, I feel like maybe it's something to think about in the future, especially since that keeps coming up.
Other questions for our job candidate?
So I'll push you a little bit more on this selection on observables assumption. And how plausible do you think? It seems like, what if it's that, these 2 parcels look the same, right, on observables, but really, the community is more invested here and less invested here, and therefore, this goes into concession, this doesn't. And that would be a problem, right, or the main problem.
So I don't think that the communities themselves had a lot of say on what they wanted to be in the concession or not. I think they demarcated the boundaries based on it had to be big enough to allow them a period of 25 years of sustainable harvesting and like a cycle of that. So it had to be large enough in that case. But I think if you, might take a while. If you look at some of the boundaries, I think there were enough. I think that, so these are these industrial concessions that I don't include in the analysis because they're under a different form of management, but they've been here for a long time. And then I think some of the concession boundaries are kind of based on where some of these other things are, so it wasn't really a choice of them picking out where they want. It's kind of like this community's been here for a while, so they already kind of have their area demarcated, and then like they can push up against some of these other boundaries. So I think there are some selection issues potentially that I'm not getting at, but I don't think that the community is kind of picking and choosing what areas they want is necessarily one of them. And also they did this, the communities themselves did this with a lot of environmental scientists and foresters that went in and kind of tried to determine what the best area is that had, like I said, had enough land and forest to be a sustainable project.
But I mean, communities in non-concession areas are clearly deciding not to form a concession. Is that right, or is that? Some like this one town where a lot of these concessions is, over 10,000 people. So I think that, maybe they formed in certain communities, maybe based on different networks and not others. And some people had no interest in it. A lot of them go to Belize and work there and do kind of day jobs. And then, like I said, up here, there was some resistance to actually forming the concession. They've had problems since they formed. Some communities do want concessions. This area up here, this actually should not be orange. Oh, no, this is a different map. This Selma Maya, there's a group of people that are trying to become a community and get control of that land currently, and that's in the process. I'm not sure where that falls into with your question, but so I think there's like a lot of different dynamics going on with how these community groups are forming. So the best I could do is try to identify the common trends among the different communities and separate them out, assuming that they're going to manage the forest area more or less effectively as a community, given they have these similar kind of backgrounds and characteristics. But in the non-concession areas, there aren't really any sort of, they're not allowed to harvest timber. There's no sort of actual management going on in these control areas. Sorry, did you have a question, James?
Yeah, you might have, I don't know if you talked about this, but did you have data on the selling points, where are they selling this stuff? Do you have,
So, one of the, maybe it's down here. So, each concession has, or it's not even necessarily in their concession, but they usually have some sort of place, where they have offices and they have where they bring the trees. And so part of the sustainable part is that they have to, when they fell the trees, they have to do it sustainably, so they're not taking down all these other trees, and then they have to drag them out on the same track. And so then they bring them all to kind of their concession headquarters where they process the wood. And kind of another part of the concession is trying to do more processing there and do value-added techniques, so when they sell it, they get a better price. But some of it's international, like the cedar and the mahogany, the kind of higher valued species, but a lot of it is also local. They make furniture and they sell it locally. So.
Wood harvested outside of the concession, illegally harvested in one of these control areas, where do they sell?
I'm not sure. I don't have any information on that. They could maybe, if they somehow could transport it into Belize. I think that's happened in kind of in the 90s, where a lot of people were based in Belize and they would come into Guatemala and harvest and then take it back out. But that was one of the reasons they formed the reserve, was try to control for some of this illegal logging that was taking place. So I don't, aside from the industrial concessions, I don't think that actually harvesting timber illegally is the issue with deforestation. I think it's more these cattle ranchers and farmers that are trying to convert the land into farming and agriculture.
So they might not be selling the timber or tearing that much for what price they get for it if they do sell it.
No, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to cut down a tree and take it somewhere and then try to sell it and process it. So you have to have a lot of equipment and machines and trucks. So and they do monitor. There's roads going in and out that people have checkpoints too. So I don't think that's the issue with deforestation going on outside of the concession areas.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, thank you.